This video is part 2 of my 3-part series about the exposure triangle. The first video was about aperture, this one's about shutter speed. We're going to dive right into what you should be doing with shutter speed in manual mode to hopefully get you off of automatic. First, let's talk about what shutter speed does. Shutter speed is how fast the camera opens and closes the shutter. So you can use this to your advantage depending on what type of situation you're going to be in. If you're in a very low light situation, you're doing landscape photography, you're going to have a slower shutter speed. If you're shooting moving birds in a wide open field with the sun out, you're going to have a much higher shutter speed to be able to freeze that motion. So I feel like a lot of people lack sharpness on their photos because they really don't understand what shutter speed does and how it works. Or even when I started photography, my shutter speeds were way too low. I always had way too low of shutter speeds, and I ended up getting a lot of blurry photos before I finally figured out how to use it. The general rule for shutter speed is 1 over the focal length of whatever lens it is that you're using. If you're using a 50mm, then you should have 1 in 50 as the minimum. Depending on if the camera has image stabilization or you're using a tripod, that stuff can change, but general rule, if you're not really sure, you can just go on the internet and pick up one of these charts. It's just a general rule that will help you with your shutter speed to start with. As a personal rule, if I was using a 50mm, I wouldn't go below 1 in 250 seconds just to make sure that I get the correct photos that I'm looking for. And really that goes back to your shooting style and what type of photos you want, but I like crisp, clear photos. So if you're shooting something that's not moving but you're handheld shooting it, like a landscape, then I would go 1 in 250 and I would set my aperture and my ISO to make up for my shutter speed. If you're using a tripod, you can get away with slower shutter speeds, but if you're not sure what shutter speed you should have or what shutter speed does to your photos, try shooting in shutter priority. This is the TV on Canon. This will help you understand how ISO and aperture work with shutter speed because the camera will adjust them for you. It doesn't always nail the photo the way that you want, and it'll give you settings to look at to see why the photo came out the way it did. Typically you can look at the settings on a photo and tell why it came out the way it did. If it's blurry, the shutter speed is too low. If it's grainy, the ISO is too high. The settings for the photo when it was taken are a great way to learn from it. For example, if you're shooting a fast moving bird and you want to freeze the motion of the bird, this must go up to say 1 in 3000. So 1 in 3000 is a fairly high shutter speed. You're going to let less light in because that is opening and closing faster. The shutter is opening and closing faster. So less light comes in. This must go down. This is a lower aperture number. A lower aperture number is a wider opening in the lens, which lets more light in. So you can kind of see how they start to work together. You're letting less light in with shutter speed, therefore you need to let more light in with aperture. In the situation where you're shooting a bird, it can have a shallow depth of field. You typically want the background out of focus, so a lower aperture number will benefit you. In this case, you don't need to adjust the ISO, and the ISO should always be the last leg of the triangle that you adjust to expose the photo properly. Say this is 1 in 3000, this is f2, and the photo is still too dark, then this must go up. The ISO is the last part of the leg to expose the photo properly, and you use it as the last part of the leg at the last setting you adjust every time you adjust your camera, or at least I do. I don't, some people shoot in auto ISO, which is fine, but I choose to try to keep the ISO lower so I don't have to do noise reduction in post. Here's a perfect example of a photo that has too low of shutter speed. This great gray owl was sitting on a branch. I was taking photos of them while he was sitting still. He decided to fly off the branch. I had my shutter speed way too low, and I missed the most important photo that I should have got. Just remember, if shutter speed goes up, aperture or ISO go down. If shutter speed goes down, aperture goes up, ISO goes up, because it all has to do with the amount of light that you're letting into the camera's image sensor. Some general tips for shutter speed would be, if you're shooting a slow moving bird like an eagle, you can probably get away with like 1 in 1200 or 1 in 1600. If you're shooting something faster like a sparrow or a falcon, then you probably need it to be 1 in 2500 or 1 in 3200. If you're shooting a hummingbird, 1 in 4,000, 1 in 5,000, because the subject is moving very fast. To be able to freeze that motion, you have to have a very fast shutter speed. Hopefully you learned something from this video. Drop me a comment and let me know if you did or didn't. I really would like to fine tune my videos a little bit for you guys so that they help you more. This is part 2. So part 1 was aperture and part 3 is going to be ISO. Depending on where you're at in the series, I will attach both videos right here. One being aperture, one being ISO, and I'll see you over in one of those.